I'm Amber Hines. I'm Elliot Hines' mother, and I'm just...
For nearly 43 years, Sheri Jo Elliott's family has been left wondering who killed the 16-year-old in November of 1983. Thanks to advanced DNA technology, a man has been identified. Michigan State Police say 75-year-old Roni Collins, who lived in Grand Blanc, killed Elliott. MSP says Collins died by suicide in January. His DNA was collected during the autopsy, and it matched evidence recovered from Elliott in 1983. As you can imagine, this is a major development for the family as they finally know who killed Sheri Jo Elliott after all these years.
I see her all the time in my head. I can see her walking in the door and giving me a hug and saying, "Hi, Aunt Judy." It's just been so long.
Sheri Jo Elliott will always be 16 to her Aunt Judy Sika. Judy often goes back to November 16, 1983. It was the day Sheri walked to the bus stop on her way to school and never made it home. Judy says Sheri had just moved to Flint after living with her father in Charlotte.
And she decided she wanted to go back to her mom's, so she went back. But I often wondered if she'd have stayed here another 2 or 3 months, maybe she'd still be here.
An 8-foot deep drainage ditch. Empty farmland stretching out in every direction. For days of silence, and the only witness for miles is a starving, abandoned dog lying 50 yards away. This is where a muskrat trapper finds her. A 16-year-old girl who left for the school bus one morning and simply never arrived. Her name is Sheri Jo Elliott, and what investigators pull from that ditch in November of 1983 will sit in a police storage locker, untouched, for the next 43 years. Because the science that could finally identify her killer doesn't exist yet. It won't exist for another 3 years. It won't be standard in American courtrooms for another 2 decades. So investigators do the only thing they can do. They preserve it, they box it up, and they wait with no idea if that wait will ever end. It ends in January of 2026, in a quiet house in Grand Blanc, Michigan, where a 75-year-old man who has spent 4 decades hiding in plain sight, playing bass guitar in local bars under the nickname Hendrix, living 2 miles from the girl he murdered, makes one final decision before police can knock on his door. He can't stop what happens next, because his DNA is about to talk for him. If you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this reason. To make sure victims like Sheri Jo Elliott don't get reduced to a case number and forgotten. Her family waited 43 years for someone to say her name and mean it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering the case that this killer's name is also tied to, and it might be closer to being solved than anyone realizes. Now let's go back to where it started. Flint, Michigan, summer 1983. Sheri Jo Elliott wasn't from Flint. Most of her life up to that point had been spent near Battle Creek and Charlotte, living with her father. But in the summer of 1983, she did what a lot of teenagers do when they want to reset. She packed up and moved in with her mother, Joyce Schultz, in a house on Seneca Street on Flint's west side. New city, new school, Carmen High, where she was starting her sophomore year. New routine. That routine is exactly what would make her disappearance so alarming so fast. Nobody who knew her described a kid who pushed limits or lost track of time. They described someone careful, shy, a little wary around people she didn't know. Understandable for a girl who just uprooted her entire life and was still finding her footing. She had a part-time babysitting job, and everyone who knew her said the same thing. She never missed it, not once. On the morning of November 16, 1983, Sheri Jo left the house on Seneca Street around 6:30 a.m. with her school books, walking toward the bus stop at West Dartmouth and Lavelle Road. Cold morning, ordinary Wednesday. She was seen waiting at that stop. And then nothing. No further sighting. No witness. Just an empty stretch of road, and a girl who never came home. By 5:30 that evening, she missed her babysitting shift. And for a girl who never missed anything, that single missed appointment landed like a siren. Joyce Schultz didn't wait to see if her daughter would turn up on her own. She started calling around immediately, and within hours, quiet worry turned into full-blown panic. By the next day, it wasn't just a mother's fear anymore. It was neighbors, volunteers, and police, papering store windows across Flint with missing person flyers, combing the streets near that bus stop block by block. But the answer wasn't in Flint. It was 40 miles away, in a place nobody had any reason to search, and what was found there would define the next 4 decades of this family's life. That's where part 2 picks up. Let me know if this direction feels right, or if you want me to try a completely different angle for the hook, for instance, opening from the killer's perspective across those 43 years, or opening on the family finding out. Sheri Jo Elliott had been missing for 4 days. Search parties had covered Flint block by block, taped flyers to store windows, called every hospital in the county. And then on November 20th, 1983, a muskrat trapper working a remote stretch of Muller Road in Blumfield Township, Saginaw County, came across something that stopped him cold. In an 8-foot-deep, waterlogged drainage ditch feeding into Cool Creek, surrounded by nothing but empty agricultural land, he found the body of a teenage girl. The only other living thing anywhere near the scene was a starving, abandoned dog lying 50 yards away. It was Sheri Jo. What happened next is one of the quietest, most devastating details in this entire case. A responding officer drove to the house on Seneca Street and handed Joyce Schultz a piece of jewelry, a ring Sheri Jo's father had given her, recovered from her body 40 miles away in Blumfield Township. That ring is how a mother found out her daughter was dead. The autopsy that followed painted a picture far more disturbing than anyone had feared. The medical examiner determined Sheri Jo had likely survived in captivity for as long as 3 days after she was taken, meaning she was probably still alive through most of the search effort happening back in Flint. While volunteers were putting up flyers with her face on them, she may have still been out there somewhere, alive, waiting. Her estimated time of death was around November 19th, just 1 day before she was found. The cause of death was exsanguination. She bled to death from 4 separate gunshot wounds. The examiner also documented that she had been sexually assaulted, and that she'd suffered severe blunt force trauma resulting in multiple skeletal fractures, along with extensive lacerations to her skin. One detail stood out to investigators at the time. The nature of the gunshot wounds didn't suggest a chaotic struggle in public. It looked more like something that happened in a controlled setting, which led some investigators to theorize she may have known her attacker, or that he'd gained her trust before she ever got into a vehicle with him. But here's the detail that would end up mattering more than anything else recovered from that ditch. Biological evidence containing the killer's DNA was found on her body. In November of 1983, that evidence was essentially useless. Forensic DNA profiling as an investigative tool didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be used anywhere in the world until 1986, in England. It wouldn't become standard in American courtrooms until the early 2000s. So investigators did the only thing they could do. They carefully preserved that evidence and put it into storage with no idea if it would ever be useful, and no idea it would sit there for over 4 decades before finally telling them exactly who had done this. If you're finding this story hard to sit with, that's the point. Sheri Jo Elliott was a real girl with a real mother who had to be handed a ring instead of a hug. Stories like hers get buried under decades of paperwork and budget cuts and cases that go cold simply because nobody had the resources to keep looking. If you want to see more families get the answers they deserve, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe and share this video with one person who'd appreciate a case like this. It genuinely helps get these stories in front of people who care. Now back to 1983. 8 months after Sheri Jo's murder, in July of 1984, the Flint Journal reported a lead that seemed, for a moment, like it might crack the case wide open. A witness came forward describing a man in his 30s or 40s with graying hair, dragging a young girl into a dark-colored vehicle around the same time and general area where Sheri Jo had disappeared. It was a specific, chilling detail, and it went absolutely nowhere. Investigators canvassed the area and conducted interviews, but without a way to test the physical evidence they'd preserved. A witness description alone wasn't enough to identify anyone. The case stalled, and then it stalled again, and again. For nearly 40 years, the Sheri Jo Elliott case followed the same painful pattern that defines so many cold cases from that era. The Michigan State Police 3rd District Cold Case Team reopened the file multiple times over the decades, each time hoping new techniques or fresh eyes might reveal something the original investigators had missed. And each time they ran into the exact same wall. There was no database to compare the preserved DNA evidence against, and no reference sample from any known suspect to test it with. The one thing that never changed through all those decades of dead ends was that the original evidence technicians had done their job properly. That biological sample sat in storage, waiting for forensic science to catch up to it. But by the early 2020s, nobody working the case had any real reason to believe that day would ever come. It did. And it came from a direction nobody expected, not a police lab, but a university sociology department. 2023 marked the 40th anniversary of Sheri Jo Elliott's murder, and it became the turning point for the entire investigation. The Michigan State Police 3rd District Cold Case Unit reopened the file with a strategy that combined two very different kinds of resources: advanced molecular science on one side and raw administrative manpower on the other. Because here's a problem that rarely gets talked about with cold cases this old. The paperwork itself becomes an obstacle. For decades of handwritten reports, interview notes, evidence logs, and witness statements, all sitting in boxes. None of it digitized, none of it searchable. Detectives working active cases simply don't have the hours to comb through 40 years of disorganized files by hand. That's where Western Michigan University's cold case program came in. Under the direction of Dr. Ashley Kirsten, a sociology professor, student investigators were brought in to help. This wasn't some loosely supervised internship either. Every student underwent rigorous background checks and intensive confidentiality training before they were ever allowed near the file. They worked inside a secure, locked room on campus, treating the material with the same seriousness as sworn investigators. Their job was to take decades of scattered paper records and turn them into something usable, comprehensive digital timelines, searchable databases, organized background profiles. And they went further than that. The students conducted deep-dive background investigations into multiple historical persons of interest, using open-source research to map out where these individuals had lived, worked, and moved throughout the years surrounding the murder. That work freed up MSP detectives to focus on something they'd never had the ability to pursue before: actually testing the DNA evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1983, using science that, by 2023, had become extraordinarily powerful. That's where we're headed next. A private lab in Texas, a method that doesn't need a suspect already in the system, and a name that would finally surface after 40 years of silence. While the WMU students worked through the paperwork, the MSP Forensic Science Division turned to a private lab called Othram, headquartered in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram exists to solve exactly the kind of problem that had kept the Elliott case frozen for 40 years. Evidence with no matching profile anywhere in a criminal database. Traditional forensic DNA testing, the kind used in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, only works if the perpetrator's DNA is already on file, meaning they've been arrested or convicted before, and their profile got entered into the system. If a killer has no criminal record, CODIS has nothing to compare the sample against, no matter how good the DNA evidence itself is. Othram uses a different approach called forensic-grade genome sequencing. Instead of a narrow set of markers, this method builds out a profile mapping hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the entire human genome. That level of detail does something CODIS never could. It allows genetic genealogists to search public genealogy databases and trace family connections through shared ancestry, rather than needing a direct match to the suspect himself. This is painstaking work. Investigators build out family trees branch by branch, sometimes vetting more than 1,000 individuals, slowly narrowing an enormous pool of distant relatives down to a small handful of people who could realistically be the source of the crime scene DNA. It's less like finding a needle in a haystack and more like reconstructing an entire haystack from a single strand of hay and then working out who it belonged to. In the Sheri Jo Elliott case, that process worked. The genealogical search generated highly specific leads, and by late 2025, all of them were pointing toward the exact same person. A 75-year-old man living in Grand Blanc, Michigan, named Roni Collins. But identifying a genetic connection is only half the equation. Investigators still needed to figure out who this man actually was, and whether his life lined up with what happened to Sheri Jo back in 1983. That's when the WMU students went back to work. Roni Collins was born in 1950, which made him 33 years old at the time Sheri Jo Elliott was murdered. In 1983, he was living on Harry Street on the north side of Flint, putting him in close, uncomfortable proximity to where Sheri Jo lived and disappeared. He wasn't a recluse or a drifter with no ties to the community. Quite the opposite. Collins was a known figure on the local Flint music scene, a traveling bass guitarist who performed under the nickname Hendrix. He played regularly at bars around the area. This was a man who was visible, social, and known by name to people all across the community, which is exactly what made him so easy to overlook as a suspect for over 40 years. Before we go further, I want to pause on something. This next part of the story involves an earlier case that some researchers and members of the public have connected to Collins. But I want to be upfront that this connection has never been legally established, and Collins was never charged in it. Treat it as what it is, a documented history of suspicion, not a proven fact. In 1969, two teenage girls, Patricia Spencer and Pamela Hobley, disappeared on Halloween night in Oscoda, in Iosco County, Michigan. At the time, Collins was 19 years old, playing in local bands around the area, and was known to drive a white van and frequent a park near the beach. Witnesses reported seeing the girls talking to someone inside a van shortly before they vanished, and that description led police to question Collins directly. He denied any involvement. Because no physical evidence existed and neither girl's body was ever found, the case went cold and stayed cold. Pamela Hobley's sister has said publicly for years that she believes Collins was responsible for what happened to her sister and Patricia Spencer. But that belief, however heartfelt, remains unproven. What we can say with certainty is this. By the time investigators reconstructed a geographic map of Collins's movements through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, they were looking at a man whose life as a traveling musician had put him in and out of small Michigan towns for decades, with more than one unresolved case in his orbit. If this story has you thinking about how many cases like this are still sitting open somewhere, waiting on a piece of evidence nobody's tested yet, that's exactly why channels like this one exist, to keep these names in front of people so they don't just quietly disappear into a filing cabinet. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because these cases only get solved when enough people refuse to stop asking questions. Let's finish this one. Investigators now had genetic evidence pointing to Collins, a documented history of suspicion tied to an earlier disappearance, and a geographic footprint that placed him exactly where he needed to be in 1983. There was only one thing left to do: get a DNA sample directly from him and see if the match was real. They never got the chance. In January of 2026, as the MSP Cold Case Unit prepared to approach Roni Collins and request a voluntary DNA sample, the 75-year-old took his own life in Grand Blanc. For the family, for investigators, and for the WMU students who'd spent years building this case piece by piece, it was a gut punch of an ending. Decades of work finally closing in on an answer, and the one man who could confirm it or stand trial for it made sure he would never have to answer for anything in a courtroom. But his death did not stop the investigation from reaching its conclusion. During Collins's autopsy, medical examiners collected a post-mortem DNA sample, standard procedure anytime a death requires forensic review. That sample was sent directly to the MSP Forensic Science Division and compared against the DNA profile extracted from the evidence preserved since 1983. The result was conclusive. It was a match. For weeks, only a small circle of investigators and WMU students knew the truth. The students had spent years learning the details of Sheri Jo Elliott's case, and now they were among the first people on Earth to know exactly who had killed her, and they had to sit on that knowledge in complete confidentiality while the official process played out. On April 13, 2026, the Michigan State Police made it public. In an official press release, they declared the 1983 kidnapping and murder of Sheri Jo Elliott solved, naming Roni Collins as the sole perpetrator. Nearly 43 years, almost to the anniversary, after a muskrat trapper found a teenage girl in a drainage ditch on Muller Road. Collins would never stand trial. There would be no courtroom, no verdict, no moment where he had to face the family of the girl he killed. But for the first time in over 4 decades, there was an answer. For Sheri Jo's surviving family, the resolution of this case brought something complicated. Relief tangled up with resurfaced grief. Her aunt, Judy Sicca, has spoken about the agony of that original search in 1983 and the horror of learning her body had been found in a ditch. She's described the mental weight the family carried for over 4 decades, saying the trauma of that discovery never really left them, not even for a day. Long before the case was solved, Sheri Jo's mother, Joyce Schultz, had spoken about a different kind of torment. not knowing what those final days actually looked like for her daughter, haunted by the idea that she had been held captive somewhere, alive, while everyone searched for her in all the wrong places. The DNA match didn't erase any of that. It couldn't undo 4 decades of not knowing, and it couldn't give the family a trial, a conviction, or a moment of justice delivered by a judge. What it did give them was certainty, a name, a face, a definitive answer to the question that had defined so much of their lives since November of 1983. Once the Michigan State Police went public, the case didn't just close quietly. It set off a wave of discussion across true crime communities, cold case forums, and podcasts. Some of that conversation centered on the timing of Collins's death, with many speculating he sensed genetic genealogy was closing in on him and chose to end things on his own terms rather than face prosecution. That's speculation, not confirmed fact, but it's understandable why people gravitate toward it. The bigger, more unsettling conversation has been about what else Roni Collins might have done. His connection to the unsolved 1969 disappearance of Patricia Spencer and Pamela Hobley, a connection that, again, was never legally proven, has led to renewed calls from researchers and podcasters for police to take a second look at other unsolved disappearances of young women across Genesee, Saginaw, and Iosco counties throughout the late 1960s into the 1980s. The reasoning behind those calls is straightforward. Collins spent decades as a traveling musician, moving through small towns across Michigan, playing shows, staying visible, and never raising enough suspicion to be seriously investigated. A transient lifestyle like that is exactly the kind of pattern that can hide a much longer history of harm. Right now, there's no way to know for certain whether Sheri Jo Elliott or even the Oscoda girls were the only lives Roni Collins ever affected. Step back from the specifics of this one case, and there are 3 lessons here that apply to cold cases everywhere. The first is about preservation. If the original 1983 investigators and evidence technicians hadn't carefully stored that biological sample, none of this would have been possible. There would have been no DNA to sequence in 2023, no genetic trail to follow, no answer for this family. Ever. The entire resolution of this case rests on the discipline of people doing careful, unglamorous evidence work more than 40 years ago, with no idea whether it would ever matter. The second lesson is about partnership. The WMU Cold Case Program shows exactly how a resource-strapped police department can multiply its investigative capacity. Not by cutting corners, but by bringing in trained, vetted, supervised students to do the massive organizational work that detectives simply don't have the hours for. That frees up actual investigators to spend their limited time on leads and lab work, not paperwork from 4 decades ago. The third lesson is about the technology itself. Traditional CODIS testing only works if a suspect is already in the system, meaning killers with no prior record can hide behind a database that has nothing to compare itself to. Forensic-grade genome sequencing and genetic genealogy erase that limitation entirely. They don't need the suspect in a database, they just need his relatives to be somewhere in the family tree of human civilization. And increasingly, that's proving to be enough. Sheri Jo Elliott's case took nearly 43 years to solve, and in the end, it wasn't solved by an interrogation room or a courtroom confession. It was solved by a single preserved sample, decades of patient work by people who never gave up on her, and a science that finally learned how to listen to what that evidence had been saying the whole time. Roni Collins never had to answer for what he did to Sheri Jo Elliott in a court of law. He never faced trial for what may have happened to Patricia Spencer and Pamela Hobley either. But because of the work of the Michigan State Police, Othram Labs, and a group of college students in a locked room at Western Michigan University, the truth came out anyway, and a family that spent 4 decades in the dark finally got their answer. If a case like this makes you wonder what else Roni Collins might have left behind, you're not alone. 14 years before Sheri Jo Elliott vanished, 2 teenage girls disappeared on Halloween night in Oscoda, and to this day, their bodies have never been found. If you want to see their full story covered next, comment Oscoda below and subscribe so you don't miss it when it goes up. Cases like this only get solved when people keep asking questions. So thank you for being here, and for making sure Sheri Jo's name, and theirs, doesn't get forgotten.